used to be that if you wanted to play in a USCF rated chess tournament, you had to get in your car and drive to an actual tournament venue. But with the COVID-19 crisis and still in full swing, we have the privilege or burden, depending on how you look at it, to play from the comfort of our homes. So this past Saturday, August 22nd, I played in my third ever online rated chess tournament through the International Chess Academy, which is a chess school based in northern Jersey. Now, the way they have their tournament set up is it's a quad system, which, if you're not familiar with that, it means that you're paired with 4 players whose ratings are usually quite similar to yours. But on this occasion, there were a little bit of lack of players at the top, so instead of a quad, I just had basically a one-on-one match against the other high-rated player in the tournament, who is an older gentleman and actually reached a national master status before I was even born. And I believe that he kind of came back to chess within the last couple of years, probably after he retired. And his rating right now is under 2100, but obviously he has years of experience, so he's a very formidable opponent. And the way this match is set up is we play one game with each color, and whoever has the most points, 1 point for a win, half a point for a draw, 0 points for a loss, gets the prize at the end, $50. And the time control, I should add, is 45 minutes and 5 seconds increment after every move, which is the longest time control that I've ever played online. But even with that being said, the first game came down to the wire. It was a very close game throughout, and it really came down to the last 30 seconds, and in kind of a time scramble, I blew what should have been a drawn position and ended up losing. So going into this game, I had to win with the black pieces in order to even the match and at least split the money. So because my opponent only needed a draw, he opened with c4, the English opening, which is known for being pretty safe and solid. And you can obviously play it for a win, but it works for a draw. So I responded with the e5, mainline English, and he goes d3, which is playing it pretty safe. So I go knight f6, he goes knight f3, attacking the pawn, I go knight c6, and here he goes a3, looking to maybe create a flank attack with something like b4. So I immediately put an end to that with a5. He can never push his pawn now, I'll just take. And now he goes b3, which at this point I realized that he was really trying to be OD safe, because a standard move here would be something like knight to c3, just developing your knight. Maybe you're going to get your bishop in the game next move. But b3, that's just a little bit too passive. And so I said, okay, I'm going to get my third piece in the game, bishop c5. And he now goes e3, continuing with this very sound, safe game plan. We'll see how that works out for him. So because he wasn't really taking the center, I decided to go for d5, just expanding. I'm playing with the black pieces, but I already have more space. And so here he took the pawn, I took with the knight, and he played bishop b2. Now he has 2 pieces attacking this pawn on e5. And my first instinct was just to defend with something like queen to e7, and then castle, develop a bishop. But then I started to think, he's so behind the development, and I could also see on the Zoom call, he was sitting there, he was really kind of calm, he was just trying to play this carefully and earn a draw. I decided to do something a little bit risky. So I played the move, bishop takes e3, sacrificing my bishop for 2 pawns. Obviously he took, and now knight takes. And although I gave up my bishop, suddenly it starts to become clear that white's position is very uncomfortable, because he still has not developed his knight, he hasn't developed his bishop, meaning he's 2 steps away from castling, and myself, on the other hand, I can castle whenever I want to at this point. And so here, this really did catch him off guard. He sat and thought for over 7 minutes. And when he did make his decision, he played the best move, which is queen to c1. But let's see what would have happened if he had played something like queen to d2 or queen to e2, which are the only other 2 moves. Obviously, you have to save the queen. So if he played queen to d2, I would then come in with knight to d4. And now these knights are very annoying for white to deal with. He can't take this knight because I have knight to c2, forking his queen and king, and now I'm going to be way ahead on material. And on the other hand, if you take the knight, then I'm able to take with the pawn, and I basically cemented this knight in the white position. It's now, again, very difficult to white to develop. He can't go here because I take. If he goes here, I can take this pawn. Very cramped position. And his only other option would be to play something like king f2, and then I'm just going to check him and start to get my attack going. So he correctly played queen to c1. And now I decided to actually take his bishop, although looking back at the game, I still could have played knight to d4. What worried me about this was that he could play something like queen to c5 and now attack this pawn. But the move I missed here is rook to a6. Kind of a hard move to find because you're not thinking about this rook over here, but it's preparing to bring the rook to the center and attack his king, which is still open. So again, he would be in a lot of trouble here. But anyway, I didn't play that. Instead, I took with the bishop, seeing that I can win another pawn, because after rook takes, I now take on d3. And now, for the price of one bishop, I have 3 pawns. And it's his move. What is he going to do? Obviously, the fact that my queen is entrenched in his camp is very worrying. So he played the move queen to c3, looking to just trade off the queens. And I said, okay, I'll take. He took with the knight. And now I played bishop e6. And now it starts to become apparent that white may lose another pawn, because this pawn on b3 is hit. And if he goes back with the knight looking to defend this pawn, I then come in with my knight. And now I'm attacking this pawn a second time while threatening this fork to pick up the rook. So after 14 minutes of thought, my opponent finally realized that there's no way to save the pawn and not a lot of ways to create counterplay. So he played the move king to f2, just looking to bring his king to safety and then clear some space for the rooks to come in. So I simply picked up the pawn, and he played a rook to e1, attacking this pawn, of course, but it simply defended with f6. And now he played knight b5, looking to create a fork here, but again, very easily defended. I simply long castled, and now not only am I defending this pawn, but my rook now has a completely open line of sight. So now he played the move rook a to c1, just developing his rook. So at this point, this is where I got a little bit stuck. Materially, I'm doing quite good, because for the price of one knight, I have 4 entire pawns. I have actually 7 pawns, and he has only 3. But the pawns can't really move so freely because his rook is stopping this pawn from advancing. I can't push this pawn because it's guarding this pawn. I can't really do much on this side of the board because these pawns are all kind of limited. So I had to decide on what my game plan was going to be going forward. So I decided that I was going to play the move g5 followed by h5 and then create kind of a kingside pawn storm. But first, I played the move rook a to e8, just centralizing the rook and making sure that he doesn't have any ways of kind of simplifying the position. Because if I went g5 immediately, I was looking at something like knight takes e5, and if I take, he's going to take here, and then if I take, he can take this pawn. It gets really messy. So in order to avoid this, I simply played the move rook to e8 first. Now he played the move king g1, just tucking his king back into safety. So now I proceeded with the plan, g5, preparing to harass his knight. So he plays rook e3, attacking my bishop, but I just played a4, cementing it. So he played h3, just guarding the g4 square, but now I added reinforcements with h5. And again, he was kind of stuck now. He spent another couple minutes thinking, and he was getting pretty low on time already. And he played a move which is pretty bad in this position, bishop c3. And I saw this move, and I immediately played bishop c4, attacking this knight, which has pretty much gotten trapped. And now he played rook b1, defending it. And now we've reached basically the critical point of the game. After he defended the rook, I saw that I can attack it again by putting my rook on d5 and hitting the knight this way. And so I did without a whole lot of thought. But I missed a tricky little bailout resource that he had. Because as soon as this rook moved up, it no longer was defending this rook, meaning this is now a very important pin on this pawn. And so he exploited this by playing knight to d4. It looks like the knight can be captured, but it's a little bit tricky because in the process I dropped the rook. And this kind of took me back a little bit because after I played rook d5, I was sure that I was just completely winning. But now after knight b to d4, the position gets pretty tricky and I have to calculate. But to take it back a move, what should I have done instead? Well, what I should have done instead of playing rook to d5 and falling right into the trap is think about the move rook d5 and what it kind of leaves behind. And if I had realized that this pin would allow this knight to d4 move, then there's an easy way to prevent it. Pause and see if you can find the move that I should have played here. So the move that basically wins the game here for black is g4. Because now, after the pawns are traded, the knight has to go somewhere. After it goes back to d2, attacking the bishop can simply go to d3, attacking the rook. And after the rook moves, now I'm able to play rook d5, and there is simply no way for him to save his knight. This move no longer works because I can take with the knight, and if bishop takes, rook takes, and I'm protecting the knight, I'm simply up a couple pawns and I'm going to win the game. And if he tries to be clever and after this take this, it doesn't work because I have this check. And after king f2, I pick up the rook. And if he takes the knight, I take his bishop. And not only am I up exchange, but again, I'm up way too many pawns. It's going to be a very comfortable victory. But instead what we had after knight b to d4 is a bit of a mess. I realized that I can't take this knight without losing something, but the alternatives aren't great either, because if I play something like rook d8, then he's going to take this knight and give me double pawns, and now it's not so clear and if I'm going to be able to win this game. So in the end, I decided to actually take the knight, which looks like it hangs the rook. But after king to d7, suddenly the rook is under attack, and the bishop is under attack. And if you played something like rook to f8, I simply take the bishop, and now, again, I have a bishop and a couple pawns in exchange for a rook, plus I have this very dangerous advanced pass pawn. So instead, in the game, instead of moving the rook back after king to d7, he actually took on d4, and after I took the rook, he took on c6, and after I recapture, he now gets to take this pawn on f6. So if you look at what happened after this whole sequence, I'm still ahead 2 pawns, but they're doubled pawns. Not good. And to make things worse, these bishops are opposite colors, which is something that is very important to know about chess endgames. Whenever you have a situation with opposite colored bishops, someone can be ahead by 2 pawns, and it's still not certain that they're going to be able to win, because the bishops can never cross paths, and they control different color squares. So at this point, I started to realize that it's going to be very difficult to win this game. But of course, I have to do my best, so I played king f7, and he retreated the bishop, and now I played king e6. We have king f2, he's just getting his king close at the center, king d6, and he plays rook e1. I played rook d3, attacking the bishop, and at this point, he only had 2 minutes on the clock, and I still had 13. But this position is becoming progressively more and more comfortable for him. He played now rook to e3, and he actually offered me a draw here. And I was thinking, nah, no draw, I can still win this. I traded the rooks off and now played bishop d5, attacking the pawn on g2, but he simply pushed the pawn up, and I attacked again, but now his pawn gets a dark square from which it's going to be safe. Obviously, my light square bishop can never touch his pawns on the dark squares. So I traded and played king to d5. And he played bishop to a5 now, a smart move, targeting this straggling c7 pawn. And I realized that I can't really push both these pawns at the same time because they're on the same file, so I decided to just jettison the c7 pawn, and I played king to c4, allowing him to take, and I played c5. But after bishop d6, he's now even still putting pressure on this pawn, meaning if I try to be sneaky and play king b3, thinking that I'm going to take this pawn in the next move, suddenly he takes this pawn, and he's now defending this pawn. And there's just no way to win this. So I played the move king d5, just backtracking and attacking his bishop, but he simply comes back. So now I tried bishop f5, at least trying to slice his king off. But he played king d2, and I played king d4, and he now tossed me a check. And at this point, it really dawned on me that there is just no shot that I win this game. Even though I have this extra pawn, which is passed, his bishop is so well placed that it guards this pawn, and it can then maneuver and guard this pawn, meaning that there's just no way that I can advance. I played king to c4, he repeated with bishop e7. The point is that I have to stay tight to this pawn in order to defend it, and if I ever push it too far, it's going to get blockaded. So, at this point, I just played king d4 again, and bishop f6 check. And the point is, if I play king to e4, he's just going to come into here. Even if I come close enough to this pawn to attack it, it's always just going to be defended by this bishop. And if I try to go the other way, and maybe play king c4, and then after this, king d5, he'll just come up with king c3. And after c4, he's just going to move this bishop back and forth the whole time, and I can't make any progress. So, at this point, I just realized that game's a draw, what can I do? And I just repeated moves with king c4, and then king back to d4, and the game was drawn. So, yeah, really tough result there. Even with this extra pawn, there was just simply no way to win this game. And definitely a huge missed opportunity. If I had just played that one little precise move, it would have put the game beyond all reasonable doubt. I would have been able to convert, and I would have split the match, meaning I at least get $25 out of the 50. Instead, I leave empty-handed just because of one little oversight. So that just goes to show how cruel of a game chess can be. Even when you play very well and put a lot of pressure on your opponent, you still have to be very accurate and very attentive, because one little trick and your advantage might slip and suddenly you go from winning to drawing and even maybe to losing. But even still, this is a very good experience. I played against a stronger player, at least on paper, who has a lot more experience. So that's it. I hope you took a little bit away from this game, and I wish you the best of luck improving your game.